it went from 0 to 50,000 people in a couple of weeks on Instagram. I had no idea how many people, cared about this issue and how many people actually agreed with the uprising.
Here follows an interview with Saher Sourouri, figurehead of the Norwegian Architecture Uprising. In this interview, Saher tells us all about how this Norwegian movement for more beautiful, humane architecture grew rapidly and how it is starting to influence the public debate about architecture in Norway. So let's not wait any longer and dive right in.
Yes, my name is Saher Sourouri. I call myself a spokesperson for the Norwegian Uprising. I joined around 2019, and I've since been very active, writing, commenting in the Facebook group and in our channels. I'm giving lectures, participating in debates, I'm meeting with politicians, with developers, and so on.
Could you tell how the uprising spread from Sweden to Norway?
The Norwegian uprising has always been there, actually, in one way or another. There was a man called Audun. He was actually doing a lot of things that the current uprising is doing back in the 70s and the 80s. And there's another man called Erling Okkenhaug, who also started to engage in debate in the 1980s, and they were fighting for a more human-centered development, less car-oriented, a more friendly architecture, a more human scale, and so on. They were raising a lot of the same concerns and arguments that the current uprising is rising. Then the Swedish uprising as a Facebook group started, I think it was back in 2014. Audun Eng and another man called Joachim Tønseth, they joined that group. And then soon after, they decided to start a Norwegian Facebook group. For a long while, it was a fairly small group, around 2,000 or 3,000 members. It was regarded as a kind of a group for eccentric people with alternative views. Then I joined it in 2019, and around the same time, another man called Erik Holm also joined. He's a social media genius. We were talking about how we can get more attention and how we can help the group to grow. So we started the Instagram group. Really, we didn't do any. There was no magic tricks. There was nothing. We were just, speaking our minds, and we were doing it in a language, as common people, users of the city, as citizens. We were talking the common man's language. It quickly gained a lot of attention, both in media and a lot of interest in the general public. It went from 0 to 50,000 people in a couple of weeks on Instagram. For the people, architects and people who work in that industry, I think it was kind of a shock. And frankly, it was for us as well. I had no idea how many people, cared about this issue and how many people actually agreed with the uprising.
How did Norway grow compared to Sweden?
I really don't know the details about how the Swedish group grew. I think it was more of a gradual thing. But as I said, in Norway, it kind of exploded over the night. But what the interesting thing is that what is unique about perhaps the Norwegian uprising is that it's huge on Instagram. The Swedish uprising is larger on Facebook. I think there's a large overlap. A lot of times we share the same posts, but often not, because Instagram is less text-based and more focused on video and images than Facebook is. The main difference is the age of the audience. Mm-hmm. Facebook is significantly older than people on Instagram. At least in Norway, the young audience, the young generation, they are very interested in this, and they're very, very active and they have very strong opinions. And you can sense the dissatisfaction with how their communities, how their towns and cities are developed.
And what are the things people are most fed up with in Norway?
The most significant dissatisfaction is that the newly built buildings are ugly. And I mean, we try to raise, different issues concerning urbanism, like building with carré structure, whether the cities are built walkable or not. And people are interested in all those topics, but whenever it comes to ugly and, beautiful ugly discussion, that's really where people get engaged. It has been an interesting development since the Norwegian Uprising started to gain attention, because in the beginning, the developers or the architects, the way they often responded was that, well, ugly and pretty, it's a kind of banal way of talking about architecture. Architecture is much more complex than that, and we need to talk about quality. It's not a question of style, it's about good materials and all, the stuff you always, you hear all day long from architects. But now they're talking about what is ugly, what is pretty, is really, why can't modernist architecture be beautiful, and so on. So we've kind of moved on. Now it's allowed now to discuss ugly and pretty, because it's when you get so much media attention, it becomes bloody obvious that most people tend to think like that about architecture. The first thing they often think when they see a building, is it ugly or is it beautiful? And it's because these are terms that reflect how buildings make them feel. Seeing this building, does that make me feel good or does that make me feel bad? Does it bore me? Does it stress me? Or does it give me a sense of pleasure? Those words are very meaningful for everybody else almost, other than architects.
Things have happened in Norway since this uprising became so popular.
I think it's too early to say. I mean, the uprising gained the attention that it has only 2 years ago. I think in the coming years we will see a change, because the developers they're admitting it themselves now that we should do better. The last week there was a newspaper interview with one of the largest developers in Norway, and they say that Arkitekturopprøret is right. We should be more considerate about what we build, how it's received by the general public, and we should put more emphasis on aesthetics. So I think there is a growing awareness, there is a change, but I think it's still too early to see the practical consequences. And there are a few coming projects that have been championed in the media by the general public, but it takes anything from 5 to 15 years from you start the process as a developer. You get the idea till you have built buildings. So it's a very gradual, it's a very long process. So, yeah. But I think they will come. Yeah.
And how about political parties? Are there already some parties that are supportive of this movement?
None of the parties had really a solid politic about architecture and city development. And they start to realize that we should do something about this. And you can see that you have two politicians from exactly the same party. One of them can be a huge fan of the uprising, and the other guy can hate the uprising, and they're from the same party. So it becomes very obvious that there is no clear politics around these matters. They're showing the interest now to do something about it. So the uprising is being, we are invited to meetings to express our views for political parties from, the entire political landscape, from far left to far right and everything in between. So this is something that all political parties are showing interest in right now. In the past, historically, architecture, just like any other cultural expression, has been and can be used as a political tool. The classical architecture has been used as a tool for democracy, for instance in the United States, where they adopted the Greco-Roman or classical architecture as an expression of democracy, while during the Nazi Germany, the strict classicism became the architecture of the Third Reich. The modernism became the architecture of socialism, but the prominent modernists like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, they were actually fascists and Nazi sympathizers. So it can be used in any way you want. Well, it doesn't matter which style of architecture it is. It can be, but I never came across a political ideology that says that beautiful architecture is bad. So architecture in itself isn't a political question.
So did the uprising in Norway experience any clashes with the media or architects or others?
No very harsh clashes like they had occasionally had in Swedish uprising between the members of the uprising and famous architects there. But yes, there have been. Some of the harshest criticism that we have received comes actually from journalists who, have labeled uprising as far right and their usual stuff. Populist. It always backlashes at them because as several polls have shown that around 70% of the Norwegian people prefer traditional architecture rather than modernists. There have been some architects who have written kind of a harsh criticism of the uprising. They only gained the sympathy of other architects, not the general public. If you were to build a project now, it doesn't matter if it was neo-Gothic or classicism or wooden or vernacular. People they would be happy to see. It would be a breath of fresh air. Finally, something that is nice, something that gives you pleasure.
Yeah.
It's not that important which style it is specifically.
Yeah. What tips would you give people at home who want to start an uprising in countries where there isn't an uprising yet? And what elements do you think are important and what do they need?
I would say, one, be courageous because you're going to get a lot of criticism from architects, from developers, from some politicians. But it's the same in at least the western part of the world. The large majority of the public, they prefer beautiful buildings. They want to see more beautiful buildings being built, and for them it makes sense to talk about building as ugly and beautiful. Study what for instance the Norwegian, the Swedish uprising has done, because it's really about having a clear message that people can relate to. Social media is a question of a lot of times about patience. You just need to keep posting, keep spreading the message, speak your own language, the way you describe and understand architecture. I wouldn't try to sound like an architect. I wouldn't try to impress an architect. You need to talk with your audience, who are the general public, who desperately need a voice. One day, one of your posts will go viral, and you get a lot of attention, and you get a lot of new followers, and the media will want to speak to you. And after that, it grows by itself.
What would you, if like an architect sees this who has trouble to perhaps break out from the mold, what would you say to this architect? To
some extent, I can sympathize with architects who want to build in traditional styles, because there's a lot of pressure from the architectural community that you cannot do this. The modernism is the architect of our time, and designing traditional architecture is reactionary and so on. So I can really understand that some people are scared that if they do something controversial, then they won't find a job, they won't get new assignments from developers. My experience from Norway is that actually is the opposite. because in Norway we are contacted by developers, occasionally large developers, and say, well, if we want to do something in a traditional style, could you recommend an architect? And then we write this and that, and they say, oh, okay, oh, well, they're German. And we say, well, actually there are no one in Norway that can do this. So I think there's a market for it, and I think the market will be growing. This is a great opportunity for a young architect or architectural firm or a young architect to establish himself as someone who can cater that segment.